Welcome to our Conversations in Philanthropy for March. My name's Rob Fisher, and I'm a faculty member here at the Mandel School. And I'm just really pleased to be with you all during this panel. I think it's a great topic. And I wanted to introduce our three panelists who are joining us this afternoon. On the far end, we have Deborah Veazey, who's the CEO of the Deaconess Foundation. We also have Brian Frederick, who's the CEO of the Community Foundation of Lorain County, and India Pierce-Lee, an alum of the Mandel School, as I'm required to say, who is a program director at the Cleveland Foundation. And they'll each say a little bit more about themselves, their organizations, and as you know, the topic today is around collaborative philanthropy. And last month, our focus was on engaged philanthropy, hands-on philanthropy through the form of giving circles. And as I was thinking about the transition from last month's topic to this one, last time it was about individuals coming together to have greater impact through giving circle work and through pooling their resources, both financial and otherwise. And really tonight it's about foundations doing essentially the same thing, coming together to have a much larger impact than they see themselves having individually. For context, if you think about the United States, we have roughly 90,000 grant-making foundations in the U.S. About 1,000 operating in Cuyahoga County. Now, some of those are quite small. You would have never heard of them. But that's a large number of potential grant makers. In all told, about $60 billion given across the U.S. Per year in grants, which is about 16% of the revenue in the nonprofit to nonprofit charitable organizations, and about $800 billion in assets nationwide. So foundation work, we all know the importance of what foundations bring to the sector, both in the resources they bring, but also in the leadership that they show, the innovation, the convening power, all those various roles that they play in the sector. And so the focus tonight is to hear more from them about how they work together, because I think many of us have relationships perhaps with individual grant makers and foundations, but we don't often think of them working across their aisles with each other. And so we want to lift up three examples in our region where this has been a feature of the work, and I'm going to let them introduce the topics that they'll each be directing their comments to. So I've asked them to start with us tonight by just sketching their foundation, a little bit about its history so you can understand their context, and then give a bit of an overview about the collaborative project that they're going to be speaking about. So with that, I'm going to carefully sit down, since I'm going to, after we do this introductory material, I'm going to come back up and have some questions for them, and then we'll open it up to the audience for your questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Deborah Veazey.
Hey. Thanks, Rob. Hi, my name is Deborah Veazey. I'm president and CEO of Deaconess Foundation. We are a private foundation. We started out as a grant-making public charity, but 3 years ago we became a private foundation and actually changed our mission focus. For our first 17 years, we focused on empowering people to become self-sufficient. And then as we went through a strategic planning process, we decided to narrow our focus a little bit and focus on helping disadvantaged individuals prepare for, get, and keep jobs. The collaboration that I'm going to talk about, though, happened under our old mission statement. This is back in 2009, 2010. It was a human services restructuring pilot project. But the one thing I want to point out is that when we went through our most recent strategic planning process, one of the things that the board decided to do was to put a second sentence to our mission that talks about the fact that we are a collaborative philanthropic partner that is interested in strengthening the human services sector. And that was a very important, and I was really proud of the fact that they did that because it really made a statement as to the value of collaboration and the fact that we see ourselves as having a responsibility to not only focus on a specific population, but when there are larger issues in our human services sector, that we want to make sure the community knows that we are interested and willing to be at the table to work on those. The Human Services Restructuring Pilot Project was something that happened it was launched in December 2009, and it concluded in 2010. And if you remember, the fall of 2008, it was a sort of a dark time in our economy. The economy had taken a real dive. People's investments and foundations endowment funds, some had decreased anywhere from 20% up to 45 and 50%. Nonprofits were really sort of reeling from that, seeing government money slash, seeing money just, reducing from all areas. And the food and crisis intervention and shelter types of organizations, what I call human service organizations, were really the hardest hit initially because you had a lot of individuals from a previous sort of middle class that all of a sudden found themselves needing these services that never needed them before. So individually, of course, we're all sitting down with our boards talking about what do we do, how can we manage this, how can we help our nonprofits, what's the best way to focus our dollars. Some foundations were making very specific decisions around what they would and wouldn't fund or upping their funding. And a colleague of mine, Denise Zeman, who used to be the president of St. Luke's Foundation, she retired a few years ago, we're sitting one day and said, we're all talking about the same thing. Let's just sit down and bring some of our colleagues around the table and talk about this. So we convened a meeting, and probably about 22 of our colleagues came, and it was a general conversation that by the end indicated that we all had a desire to truly help our grantees in a meaningful way. Because what a lot of us were saying is just do more with less, try to figure it out, we'll try to help you as we can. And for the first time, a lot of nonprofits were really thinking about mergers. They were thinking about, some type of strategic restructuring, realizing that there just weren't enough dollars to go around. So what we all realized is, even though we had different mission statements, that there was this common thread of wanting to help the nonprofit community think about how to work through this crisis and find ways to do that. And rather than having them go off on their own, we decided, why don't we think about putting together a program where we jointly can help educate each other and learn and experiment around strategic restructuring. Because back then, merger was a bad, the M word was a four-letter word. And what we wanted to make sure nonprofits understood is that there's much more in that continuum of strategic restructuring other than a merger. And so Denise and I went off and tried to look at who else was doing what, and we were surprised when we came back to see there wasn't a whole lot happening yet. We found a small little collaborative effort happening in Dayton, Ohio, but other than that, there wasn't much there. So we said, well, our community needs this. Let's go ahead and put together a concept paper. So Denise and I put together a concept paper for this pilot and went back and presented it to our colleagues, and they all were very excited about it. And within a month, we had 18 colleagues that had committed $425,000. And again, that seems like a fast turnaround for philanthropy, and it is, but we were in a crisis, and there was a very strong sense of urgency that we needed to do something. And so with that in mind and with that kind of support in mind, we decided to move forward, and we created what we called the Human Services Restructuring Pilot Project. We didn't give it a fancy name, but we wanted to, be very specific to say this is what it is. And it had 3 phases. The first phase was an educational workshop launch. And we invited 81 different nonprofit organizations to come. 76 came. They brought their executive directors and board trustees. But the foundations pulled back, and we said, this is a process for you. We wanted to honor confidentiality, and Denise and I introduced said thank you and turned it over to the 3 consultants that we had hired for this project. So I should talk about that. We realized that we needed partners to help us, so we had engaged a consultant team of 3 very well-respected consultants to work with the individuals that might be interested in this. We hired Rob Fisher to help us go through an evaluation phase after each pilot, because this was evolving and needed to be adjusted and modified based on what we were learning. And then we hired Ohio Grantmakers Forum, now known as Philanthropy Ohio, to act sort of as a convener and a fiscal agent. And then the last partner we had was Mandel, which was a communications firm, because we thought maybe some nonprofits may need some help thinking about how do we communicate both internally and externally about our participation. So we had the launch. It was very successful, and the second phase was really allowing people that had come to say, are we really interested in moving forward? Are we really interested in thinking about strategic restructuring? It was completely their decision. It was not mandated in any way. And 43 of the 76 organizations that had gone to the educational workshop expressed interest. So at that point, we had the consultants work with these organizations, filling out various assessment forms, having one-on-one interviews, to really determine, are they ready? Do they really have a partner identified? And after that, the consultants came to us and said that they felt there were 17 organizations that they put into 7 clusters that they felt were really ready to move ahead. We agreed to do that. We made sure we had enough funding to be able to support that. And those organizations were then invited to go on to phase 3, which was the actual intensive phase of restructuring, where they were assigned to a consultant team, and they worked with that team from June to December in trying to effect some type of strategic restructuring. And I'm happy to say that there were 4 significant strategic restructurings that came out of that. All of them were very different from a legal perspective. It was whatever made sense for them. But I'm sure you've heard of these organizations. There was the Domestic Violence Center, and the Bellflower Center for Prevention of Child Abuse was one. The Center for Families and Children in Wessam. Youth Opportunities Unlimited in East City, and then lastly, New Directions and a Lake County organization called Crossroads that worked with adolescent counseling services. When we started out, did not have a targeted outcome of we want to see X number of mergers. We really wanted this to be an educational and learning experience, so we were thrilled that there were 4 that came out of this. We didn't set expectations about you have to save money, you have to reduce people. That was their decision to make. But since that time, we work with these organizations, and they all have said to us, yes, this was a good thing to do. One of the other things we committed to was doing a case study. We did a case study immediately as a follow-up, and Dr. John Yankee and Carol Willen are in the audience, and they did a fabulous job with that case study, and they did such a good job that 2 years later we decided it was important to do a follow-up to really say, how are these organizations doing 2 years apart? And so they also did a second year, and I think Rob sent you something with a link. All of the information, all of the case studies, all of the materials we used in the pilot are on the Foundation Center's website, and I would encourage you, those of you that want more detail, to go ahead and check that out. I just want to point out a couple important things about this collaboration of 18 foundations. It was very important to invite and engage the nonprofit leaders that we were trying to help in the process, and we did that in 2 ways. We had them come and help us choose the consultants, because we know having that personality match is critical, and they also really approved, if you will, the design of the pilot, because if you're trying to create something to help someone, they need to have a voice in that process. And we are very glad we did that, because we think the process was that much more robust and effective because their voice was at the table. Having a team of consultants we think was important, because we know that, it's important that the consultant and his or her personality meshes well with that particular organization, so we wanted the nonprofits to have an option as to who they would or wouldn't work with. But the most important thing, I think, was that the foundations were really, we all placed both our personal and our organizational egos at the door. This was about helping the community, and it wasn't about any one of us. And I was just so proud of this group of colleagues that we all came together, and Denise and I just sort of became the de facto co-chairs. And so we would meet face to face, we would have conference calls, emails, keeping them informed, but there was complete support throughout the process from them. But I guess what I would say as far as some key lessons with, doing a collaboration of this sort is that, participation is a huge commitment. It was a huge commitment on the part of myself and my foundation and all the foundations involved, and we know it was a huge commitment on the part of the nonprofits that decided to participate in that. There's always a few people that'll do a majority of the work. That's just the way it goes, and you have to go in with that expectation and not be upset when there's some that are spending a lot more time than others. The good thing is that we all had a common passion for this particular purpose. Even though we had separate missions, we all agreed that this was a priority, and we were all willing to allocate our time and our resources to this. And then the most important thing, I think, is just communication, communication, communication. Communication internally and communication externally. The other point that I'll make is that the confidentiality was a real issue, and the relationship between the nonprofits was with the consulting team. We did not interface with them, and the consulting team held that confidentiality. We were only involved at the point where they were making recommendations as to who should move on, but we were not privy to any of the conversations. We were not involved in any of the meetings. We didn't attend the educational workshops, and I think that definitely led to the success of the pilot. But I'm going to stop now because I know we're going to have time for Q&A later, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview of sort of how the collaborative got together and a little bit about it.
Thank you, Deborah. I did want to mention there is a two-page, front and back flyer that has a description of each of the three examples that our panelists are talking about, including a web link to additional information if you're interested. So if you didn't pick it up, it'll be at the table outside when you come in. And now we'll go to Brian.
I appreciate it. I think this is the fourth time I've heard that. Every time I hear it, I think it is such a neat example of collaboration. So thanks again. I'm Brian Frederick. I'm president and CEO of the Community Foundation of Lorain County. I like to say that we're just like the Cleveland Foundation, except we're about 65 years younger and about $2 billion less in assets. So, but the big difference, as with every community foundation, is that we are really designed to uniquely serve the needs of Lorain County. We're about 30 years old. We've got about $120 million in assets. We have 590 different endowment funds that we manage. Over half of our assets, and this is another distinction from the Cleveland Foundation, but over half of our assets are in designated funds to specific nonprofit organizations or schools. So we don't have, and 93% of our assets have some charitable restriction on them. So that really impacts what we can do. And frankly, economic development was one of those areas that we really couldn't tackle because we had very few resources from donors that had a passion about that or had set up their funds to allow for funding. So I want to talk about the Fund for Our Economic Future that I've had the fortune of being involved with since the beginning. But before I tell you a bit about the collaborative, I'd like to take you back to 2003 in Northeast Ohio. We were, as we are now, very fragmented. Home rule dominates Ohio. It's written into the state constitution, and it permeates almost everything we do. And in the 16-county area in Northeast Ohio, we have something like 990 governmental taxing entities. So we've got a lot of little pieces doing a lot of stuff. 16 counties, 4.5 million people. About the same size as Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte has, I think, 4 governmental entities. So it's a very different situation. The economy was very much viewed as crumbling. As you recall, this is right after the quiet crisis. And so there was some growing sentiment. Economic development was extremely fragmented, and everything was at the local level. And our primary strategy was how best to get a business to move out of a neighboring community. In fact, we've got stories in Lorain County about businesses that were interested in coming into Lorain County and never got a proposal because there was so much fighting between municipalities on who was going to write the proposal that a proposal never got written. And it was pretty much that way throughout Northeast Ohio. Entrepreneurialism was pretty much dead. There was very, very little venture capital coming into Northeast Ohio. Not a lot of innovation. There was the beginnings of some growth in that area, but Entrepreneur Magazine, the first issue that they came out, I think they had, 45 or 65 rankings, and Northeast Ohio, Cleveland was dead last. We had growing indications that we really needed to look at ourselves as a regional economy because the rest of the world was looking at us as a regional economy, and even Cleveland was too strong to really compete independently. But yet we still had this very fragmented, very parochial mentality in terms of that, and very few people referred to themselves as living in Northeast Ohio. And there was a sense of malaise after certainly the recessions, and it seemed like every recession we went down much further than the rest of the country and never quite got back up to where we were until the next recession hit and took us even deeper. And so it wasn't a great place. Actually, it was India's former CEO, Steve Minter, that called together the four largest community foundations, Stark County, Akron, Lorain County, and Cleveland, and we sat down because we were all getting a number of requests for regional things. And there was a growing number of requests from nonprofit economic development intermediaries that were beginning to do some work. And for most of us, other than the Cleveland Foundation, this was foreign territory. We, like most foundations, made grants in the arts and community building and community development and health and education and social services. We didn't know that much about it. Cleveland Foundation had just hired Brad Whitehead as a fellow. Steve got us together and said, listen, what are we going to do about this? And maybe it makes sense for us to now get together on a periodic basis and share notes. Had a couple of meetings, and we started looking at all of the requests and pieces and how it was really overlapping the geographies that we traditionally had kind of held as ours. We had good working relationships, but we didn't overlap because Cleveland did what they did in Cleveland, we did what we did in Lorain County, but we were seeing some overlapping. And Gunn Foundation and GAR Foundation said, listen, if you open this conversation up to private foundations, I think there's something there, and I think you'll find some interest. Within a very short period of time, we had 30 foundations that said, we need to do something together, and it needs to be more than just sharing notes. And so the fund was really born within about 6 months. The initial principles of it were pretty simple. It said for membership, we want to have people in the organizations that have skin in the game, and we want to have some staying power. So foundations, and this is one of the themes I'll come back to, it's the adage that culture trumps strategy every time. What do foundations do? We make grants in 3-year tranches, okay? At least that's the perspective. And so we started out looking at a 3-year period. Can we get foundations to commit for 3 years to see whether we can build enough money to do some pooled grant making? And we said we're going to try to do different rule of engagement, if you will. Instead of basing things on proportional population or size of the county or anything like that, we're going to have one foundation, one vote. And if a foundation puts in $100,000 over the 3-year period, they get a vote. Okay? If they put in more, they still get a vote. So we're going to make decisions based on kind of majority rule. We're going to work toward consensus, but we're going to make decisions together. We aren't going to earmark money. It's going to be one pot of dollars, and we as a group will get together and figure out what the best use. And by doing that, we can have some learning going back and forth. And so the fund was born. And we had, I remember the first 3 years, Cleveland Foundation put in $10 million. We put in $100,000. We each got a vote. That was really different. And frankly, that opened the eyes of a lot of us outside of Cleveland. And it certainly built some immediate trust with my board. Initially, there was no separate organization, and we were a series of parallel pass-through funds at each community foundation in Northeast Ohio. So the idea was foundations in Lorain County that felt comfortable with us would give to the Fund for Economic Future Fund at the Community Foundation of Lorain County. Same thing in Akron, same thing in Stark. Cleveland Foundation was the fiscal sponsor. When they needed money, they would call on us. We would send money to them, and it worked out really well. We've evolved much beyond that, but we gave a lot of thought to how do you build trust and relationship between organizations that knew each other, we liked each other, but we didn't work together. And how do you build a regional infrastructure with something that doesn't exist? And so it was a kind of a painstaking process. So what I'd like to do for a couple of minutes is take you through the phases that we've had and kind of the scope of work, and we'll get back into some of the specifics again. But during the first 3 years, we were really trying to figure this out, and I call it the what do we do phase. And so a big part of what we focused on was some research. We got a group together. We worked with local universities. We worked with the Fed. We said we need to figure out what it is in a regional economy that we ought to be doing, we ought to be looking at, and we ought to be measuring. And so I think it was the barometer, Northeast Ohio barometer, but that was part of it. The second piece, there were some economic development nonprofits out there that were beginning to do some work. And what do foundations do? They make grants. So grant making was a second piece of work that we did. And our theory behind this was, would it make a difference with these economic development organizations if they got one large grant over a 3-year period and didn't have to go out to 20 different foundations to do a dog and pony show? So there was an efficiency scale in that. What we didn't know, and we had to experiment, was getting a large amount of money from an organization or a group like the Fund for an Economic Future. Would that leverage other dollars, or would other foundations or funders look at it and say, well, you've got all the money you need, we aren't going to fund you? We didn't know that. So that was one of the unknowns in the beginning. The third piece of work that we did during the first, I'm going to give credit to my colleague on the left, because we basically said, if we do all this, but given that we've got this malaise and we've got this parochial kind of attitude and everybody is thinking about their own community, if we don't change the hearts and minds of the people of Northeast Ohio, this is all for naught. And so there was a huge engagement called Voices and Choices, where we tried to have a conversation with Northeast Ohio. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of effort. We had some great conversation, and it kind of ended. But we had the conversation, and people still talk about whatever happened to Voices and Choices. And there was some outgrowth of that, but it was a conversation that we frankly couldn't sustain, I think, because of dollar amounts. And maybe you want to talk about that a little bit later. So during the first phase, we kind of figured out what it was that philanthropy's role could be in economic development. So the next 3 years was really about creating an agenda, and it was called Advance Northeast Ohio. We put a lot of work into trying to get a lot of voices into that agenda, but based on the research, based on what we knew, based on what we thought we knew, what should this agenda be, and what can be a tent that we can get everybody underneath to move Northeast Ohio forward? And one of the things we discovered with that, we also did grant making, we also continued research, but one of the things that we realized about Advanced Northeast Ohio is that if you're creating a tent and you don't have the relationships and don't have the trust, that tent becomes getting fuzzier and fuzzier, because to get commitment, there are pieces about it that you don't have agreement, you don't have trust. And so what we ended up with was an agenda that sounded really good, but frankly didn't have a lot of meat to it. But it was still an agenda, and we had businesses that said they were buying into it, and we had government entities that said they were buying into it, and philanthropy bought into it. And so we had it. And so our hope was that, frankly, we could pass off much of this work to somebody else. That there would be, the business sector would take over the stuff that related to business. There were pieces that we thought government sector could take over. And what we realized at the end of phase 2 was there wasn't anybody at the regional door other than the Fund for Economic Future. The business didn't have an entity regionally that was a forum for all business. And even though there were some organizations, it was still pretty much centric to Cleveland or Cleveland and Akron or Akron. And there was really no counterpart out there. So the third phase, the third three-year phase of the fund was really about identifying, supporting, and empowering groups that were doing this work in the region. In fact, my colleague on the left was co-chair of another group called Engage and Empower, which I thought was great. But it was one of the pieces of work, again, in addition to grant making and in addition to research, on trying to find innovation that was happening, frankly. And we were hearing of a lot of groups and folks that were doing some really good stuff, but they weren't on any official radar screen. And so we wanted to identify them, figure out how can we create a structure that can really help this work go forward if we don't have formal sector organizations or infrastructure to do that. And there was a lot of good stuff really that came out of that. The fourth phase was when, frankly, the regional economic competitiveness strategy began to take hold. The business community, through some of the intermediaries and Team NEO, got interested in this. As you recall, the state tagged Team NEO to be their intermediary for Jobs Ohio. They had some governmental sanction. There was some money that was going to be coming down with that, and the business community got interested. And they basically looked at what we had done in the fund and said, listen, you've got a great start. What if we work together to take this regional strategy but really put some meat on it and move it forward? And so there was a lot of work to figure out how we get that started. And much of the next 3 years, in addition to research and in addition to some grant making, was about creating this partnership with the business community. And what we learned was we had gone through some tremendous growing pains in building the collaboration. And we had the advantage of having relationships already established and some working, even though it wasn't nearly as deep. When we got into the business sector, it was a whole different ballgame. And it was taking much longer, and it was a much slower process, and it didn't necessarily, and it still doesn't work quite in the same way. We tend to be much more tolerant of process. The business sector doesn't want process, they want results. And I don't know how you do this work unless you have somebody focusing on process. So a lot of learning curves with that. We're now in the fourth three-year phase, and through some research that's been done both by the fund, by the Fed, by any number of different organizations, we're now really understanding that just to do economic development, quote unquote, doesn't cut it. There was some research called What Matters to Metros that was sponsored by the fund, and we found a number of things, but one of the things we found was that areas that had the highest job growth oftentimes had the highest increase in the income gap also. Las Vegas was a poster child. I think as a region, they had the highest percentage of job increase in the country, but they also had the highest increase in the income gap between those that have and those that don't. And so this emerging growth and opportunity agenda was really beginning to take hold. And essentially, it was saying that if you want to have a sustainable economic improvement in your region, you have to both focus on economic growth and economic opportunity at the same time. And even though it's tough, and even though there aren't a lot of models out there, you got to dig into it and try to figure out how to bring the economic development camp, chambers, the Team NEOs, the Team Lorraine counties, government entities, along with many of the nonprofit and foundation groups that have been working on the opportunity side, and figuring out how do you bridge language, how do you bridge strategy, and how do you get working together. The fund now is pretty totally focused on that, and we're trying to push it even more, particularly on the opportunity side, because that seems to be the more difficult aspect of economic development. And so we're operationalizing that as you've got to focus on three different areas for growth and opportunity: job creation, which is traditional economic development; job preparation, which is job development, workforce development, figuring out how to get people trained to be able to take advantage of the jobs you have and have a workforce to attract businesses or expand businesses even further; and job access, which is one that we oftentimes don't focus on, but that's both physical access, transportation, and also social access in terms of discrimination, in terms of hiring practices, or sometimes even where businesses are located in sprawl. So we're just starting that phase right now. We're still doing grant making, we're still doing research, but what we're attempting to do this phase is be real champions in the region for the opportunity side of the equation to make sure that we've got balanced efforts through Team NEO and the Regional Economic Competitiveness Strategy at the local level and at the regional level, focusing both on growth and opportunity. And we think that's an appropriate role right now for philanthropy. So I think I'll end there.
I think it's safe to say we could have done 3 sessions, 1 session on each one of these examples, and we're so. My apologies for we're having to force our panelists to stay a little higher level than they might otherwise go. I'm going to introduce my third panelist with this beautiful cover on which she appears. It says, India Pierce Lee, Growing Lettuce and Changing Lives One Head at a Time. Just on the newsstands, Northeast Ohio, Boomer and Beyond magazine. So after embarrassing her, I'll let her take the reins now.
Yeah, till I finally made it, boomers. Yeah. So a little bit about the Cleveland Foundation. As Brian mentioned, we're the oldest community foundation in the country, celebrating our 102nd anniversary. We have about 2.2 billion in assets, and in 2015 gave away over $95 million, which represented over 4,200 grants. Our grant making is done 3 ways. We have what we call board-directed initiatives. This is proactive grant making, and like you were saying, the 3-year tranche. When Ron Richard came to the foundation, he was wondering, why are we just, the senior staff just doing paperwork, basically, and not on the ground understanding the needs in the neighborhood. So divided the foundation where we have program directors like myself with specialization around economic development, education, neighborhoods, arts and culture, youth development, health and human services, and economic development. So we focus on long-term 5, 10, 15-year systemic issues, working with a handful of grantees every year and partners around these issues. Then the rest is board-directed and donor-directed funds. So 50% of our endowment is unrestricted, which allows us to do the proactive grant making, and that's pretty unique to the foundation, to foundations in general, which gives us the flexibility to be more nimble and flexible and try different things. I talked about our areas: arts and culture, youth development, neighborhoods, public education reform, and our priorities really is to give access and programs to vulnerable and underserved communities, as well as helping nonprofit organizations build capacity, but also act as and test ideas and partnerships and support policy and advocacy. We see ourselves more than just a grant maker, but as a partner, a supporter, a convener, a participant sometimes, but also a thought leader to the organizations that we work with. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about our initiative, the Greater University Circle Initiative, which really came out of this idea of creating collaboratives. Ron Richard had been here about 2.5 years in the city, and have been meeting with all the top leadership, here at Case Western, Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, the VA, and quickly realized the power here in University Circle of all these institutions, along with all the other cultural institutions in this area. So Ron began talking about convening Cleveland Clinic, Case, UH. Now, think in 2005 when you start talking about bringing not one of the institutions, but all 3 together. And he got a lot of pushback. You'll never get these institutions to sit down. You'll never get them in the room to talk to each other. There's no way you're going to get these institutions to work together. And despite that, he said, I'm going to try it. And it included the city, the Regional Transit Authority, other foundations. Well, we're in our 11th year of this collaboration. And what Ron said, not here to change anything anybody's doing, but just have a conversation, which was unprecedented at the time. There was over $3 billion of institutional development on the drawing board. Cleveland Clinic's new LA and Heart Center, University Hospitals, new emergency room, the VA hospital was expanding the domiciliary parking garage, the bed tower, CMA was, the Art Museum was expanding, CIA. So it really was a a really grand time in the city and really unprecedented to have that much development on the drawing board. And as we know, each institution would have done this in a vacuum. So part of the work was, and I wasn't at the foundation yet, but working with them when I was at Neighborhood Progress, and my colleague Lillian Curry was a consultant with my predecessor, Jay Talbot, at the foundation. But what it did, it gave us an opportunity to really take a step back and look at how can we leverage this work together. And at the same time, the neighborhoods around these institutions, you had about 50,000 residents, incomes less than $18,500, 34% foreclosure, educational attainment, bad, we don't need to talk education in schools, all the things that's going on in any urban core. What really happened as we began to have this dialogue with the institutions, we put up a map that basically showed the blight, the foreclosures, the indicators of risk. And it was really like the aha moment for everyone, that for these institutions to succeed, the neighborhoods around them also have to succeed. And so we began a dialogue and got each of the institutions, along with our community development corporations, to provide their master plans, and looked at these consolidated master plans. And it started a dialogue. And when I was hired into the foundation, Lillian Curry and I began sitting down with each of the institutions and really talking about how do you open these institutions back up to the community? How can we work together? So we started with started with physical development, the Uptown Development Project. We partnered here with Case Western to get that off the ground, and we gave early funding, $1 million, to really look at the public realm and hire world-class architects. In addition, we began looking at the 3 transportation projects around University Circle, as we know lovingly called Suicide Circle down here, the reconfiguration of that, looking at the East 120th RTA station, which was just going under the bridge to East Cleveland. And for over 10 years, RTA had tried to work with Little Italy and the community to move that station to where it is today with no success. My predecessor, Jay Talbot, was brilliant. He gave some money to Little Italy to bring them to the table with RTA. It was the first time that the RTA had worked with a community partner. And now we have a new station. And then the Cedar Hill Rapid Station. What was unique about the partnership, we started with the physical development. We raised a little over $1 million for the 3 transportation projects and created a project account at the foundation. That $1 million to date has leveraged over $44 million to get those transportation projects done from state and federal institutions, but primarily because it was the partnerships and the collaboration. The Uptown project, that started before the crash, and getting bank financing was very difficult. So several, I think it was 15 sources of funding came together, Gun Foundation, the city, us, and several other players, to put together a package to get phase 1 of the Uptown district going. And once we, got that financed and phase 1 began, quickly took off. We have now amenities here, which used to be parking lots, Quiznos, McDonald's, no campus life, not only for students, but for the residents here. For the foundation, Cleveland Foundation, we have invested between MOCA, Maximum Independent Housing, Cleveland Institute of Art and Uptown, about $12 million just in that 3-block corridor, $6 million in program-related investment, low-interest loans, as well as $6 million in grant to really facilitate and help get this off the ground. But that was $150 million leveraged from so many people. So again, working together, and it was unique to have the City of Cleveland Economic Development Department, you got the Regional Transit Authority, everyone working together to really begin to think about change. The next piece of the work was to launch an employer-assisted housing program. And we looked at University of Pennsylvania, we looked at OSU Partners and Yale. And one of the things we learned quickly from those institutions, that as you develop these neighborhoods, to also think 15 and 20 years out. So how can we stabilize the neighborhoods by bringing people working at these institutions into the neighborhood, but what do we do with the existing residents and also build that capacity? So as we began the employer-assisted housing, we worked with Fairfax Renaissance Development Corporation, the CDC, and University Circle, who actually manages and markets the program. We raised $4 million for the initial pool that I'm happy to say that the anchors and the foundation now have re-upped with an additional $3.1 million. After we initially launched that. We have 518 new residents that live in the 7 neighborhoods around this University Circle, but that's just one small piece. We also began looking at working with the institutions around higher local. One of the, unemployment in this area is about, depending on how you count it, 25 to 45%. And that's, people 18 to 64 that's looking for work. When you add people who have given up, the numbers are higher. And so beginning to talk with the institutions about how do we leverage your procurement power, how do we leverage your buying power, but more importantly, how do we leverage their thought leadership? That this wasn't about charity, this wasn't about writing checks, but really how do we create viable neighborhoods? And it was, like anything else, you build the relationships, you build the trust. And to date, I am, proud to say that it has been a really great partnership in getting to understand how the anchors do business and getting the neighborhoods also to create a dialogue about how to do business with the anchors. One of the key components, we have Neighborhood Connections, which is a community engagement piece and the most critical piece to our work. And it's a program under the foundation that was doing small grants citywide. We began to really look at how do we create engagement where we're breaking down barriers, not only among residents across neighborhoods, but between the institutions and neighborhoods. And so working through Neighborhood Connections through what we call community engagement and connect. They've been the leader around the workforce development work, working with the institutions and anchors. We have a Neighbor Up network for University Circle with over 1,400 members now. I know that Mark Joseph, a lot of staff here at the school is very involved in that. And it's become a model around not only the city, but nationally in how to engage people. If we had started, with community engagement and went to the anchors like we used to, banging on the door, telling them what to do, I wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. But really learning how to work together. We have several workforce components to Evergreen Co-ops, which was a huge experiment in how to do business. And that really came from looking at economic inclusion. We had training programs all over the city. People go, they get a certificate, they might get a job. And if they did, it didn't lead to anywhere. We hired Ted Howard with the Democracy Collaborative, who actually surveyed the institutions and several partners. They came back with, at that time, about 60 or 70 ideas of low-hanging fruit of if these businesses existed in the neighborhood, how can we help support them? And so the Evergreen Cooperative Laundry, which is a LEED Gold commercial laundry, actually grew out of the VA hospital. The solar company, Evergreen Energy Solutions, came out of Cleveland Clinic. And they're now not only doing solar installations, weatherization, housing rehab, but the big piece now is replacing LED lighting in all the buildings at Cleveland Clinic and working with CASE and UH. But also they just completed a large installation with the city of Cleveland Heights. Really being proactive and using the procurement power to get these companies off the ground. And then Green City Growers, which is the third co-op, which is the largest hydroponic greenhouse in the country. It grows over 3 million heads of lettuce annually. It's the size of 3 football fields, and now also growing basil for a local food producer to do all their nationwide food production for basil for their pesto. So a lot of experimenting and a lot of risk. And that's the thing that makes my job. The foundation and our partners were willing to take those risks. You talk about businesses, right? Starting entrepreneurial. We really took some huge risks with that. But the bottom line was to try to get people employed. How do we create jobs that exist to hire people from the neighborhoods? And it's still an experiment and still trying. Working with university hospitals, we have a program called Step Up to UH, hiring people from the neighborhoods in entry-level jobs. Then once they've been there over a year, there's another program called Bridge to the Future where they get people their GEDs and associate degrees, and working with Case and Cleveland Clinic. Started out as a pilot to hire 7 people. Over 100 people have been hired to date, working with neighborhood connections and towards employment. And now University Hospitals is looking at how to roll this out system-wide. So again, small things to look at bigger changes. At Cleveland Clinic, they're working with Fairfax Renaissance Development, trying a program called Welcome to Fairfax to hire people across different job levels. They've hired over 50 to date. And then Newbridge Cleveland Center for Arts and Technology, which is 5 years old now, training people as phlebotomists and farm tech from Cleveland, across Cleveland, working with the anchors, Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, as well as Metro Health and CVS and Rite Aid. So really trying to look at a continuum and ways to create jobs, create wealth, and stabilize the community. The next big piece of work, now that we're moving forward, Neighborhood Connections is leading a community health piece with Cleveland Clinic, UH, and Case Western, and it's around lead and infant mortality. And so that's the next big important piece of work. The neighborhoods we are working in have the highest lead and infant mortality than anywhere else in the county, more than 20 to 30% higher. And if you think about it, we have the best health care in the world, yet the neighborhoods right around it have the most health disparities. And so, this has really been a learning experience that we continue to learn from each other, but continue to grow. I think what made this, the partnership so unique was, that at the same time that Ron began talking to people, you had brand new leadership at every single institution. Mm-hmm. Chris Ronayne was new at UCI, Tom Zinti, Toby Cosgrove, then it was after President Hundred, and then we had President Eastwood interim, and now Dr. Snyder, who has really been really active in this. And so we, every 3 years, sit down with the leadership and determine what our 3-year priorities are. And then Cleveland State at the Levin College acts as our local evaluation partner, collecting data on each pieces of the initiative to see where we are and how things are working and where we need to adjust. So it's a multi-pronged approach. It's a lot of work. And when we have cities come here from other places trying to adapt this, they say, what makes it work? I said, first, you have to have a convener. Number 2, you have to have 1 or 2 people that get up every single day. I heard you when you were talking about, how you get this work done, that's all they do is focused on keeping the partnerships, building the relationships, and keeping it all together. And 3, finding those partners that are passionate about this work and giving, resources to those partners to carry out the work, but at the same time working together. So, did I catch us back up?
Wonderful. All right. Well, your head should be swimming. Mine is.
Did I catch us back?
So what I'm going to ask you to do is, there's the details of each of these examples, and we want to go up one level to kind of tease out some common themes across these examples. So if we let's simplify the decision that funders make. One is they can put their money individually into programs, projects, initiatives, kind of the go-it-alone mentality. A second might be that they put their money into initiatives independently, and other funding partners put their money into those same initiatives. So they show up in the same revenue account, but they didn't really work together. And then you have examples like these where funders come together and coordinate their work before things get funded, a prospective kind of vision of grant making. Now, what I heard from these examples, I heard the critical aspect around personal conversations and relationships leading to some of the advent of some of these, some born out of crisis, some born out of opportunity. And I guess my question an initial question for the panelists is about motivation for funders to even do this, because the complications go up exponentially when you step into this world. And I presume that the payoff potentially also goes up that. But could we get a few comments on the motivation to even go this path and the difference in practice of normal foundation business compared to these projects? And anything you'd like to call out for our audience on that front.
And we have another 45 minutes. That's right. To handle this.
And this will be the only question we're
I'll relate back to when we got started with the fund and just some of my thoughts and some of the thoughts that I heard from my board. And it very much was self-serving. We didn't have expertise in this area. We didn't have a lot of resources in this area. But we knew that it was the right thing to do, both within Lorain County, and we knew that, we've got such a population in Lorain County that works in Cuyahoga County. So if Cuyahoga County does better, our residents do better. So we knew that there was that connectivity to. A lot of it was, we saw the problem, we realized that we really couldn't do it alone. And frankly, I was excited about being able to tap into the knowledge of others in the region. And it was a bit of an adventure, and I always like a bit of an adventure. So, but I think that was a big part of the motivation, was realizing that something was possible here that had no chance of being possible if we just took it on alone.
I would say that with us, the motivation was just the crisis at hand was just so immense and in a way frightening that it brought all of us to the table. But another motivation for us individually, but much more so collectively, was the fact that we knew and we had a desire to have meaningful impact. And when we thought about how we could approach this individually, the level of impact that needed to happen was really nothing that any one of us individually could have attained. And we all understood that and realized that this was time for us to come together to really have impact at a level that was meaningful.
I think, again, when we got new leadership at the foundation, at the time, really looking at how to be more proactive rather than being reactive to not only the crises in our community, but the opportunities. And one thing Ron did was hire people into the foundation that actually had expertise in each of these areas that we're working in. So I think that was something that was a little bit different.
Is this necessarily a rare event, would you say? Or should we expect this to happen more than it does? And do you think these examples encourage subsequent collaboration among funders? Or are these kind of one-offs, they're special circumstances, big crisis, big geography involved, anchor institutions need to coordinate? What should we expect, do you think, along these lines?
Well, I guess I would say that, there were a lot of important lessons that we learned from working together, lessons that I think have stayed with all of us. In the area that Deaconess is now focused of employment for the disadvantaged and workforce, it is, painfully obvious to us that in order, again, to take a dysfunctional workforce system and begin to move it, on a path toward really being able to be much more efficient and effective, we can't do it alone. But being able to come together and work together takes trust. And so I believe that collaboration is happening today by little, projects that Deaconess may be doing with one or two grantees or with the fellow funder. We're building trust there, and then that will allow us to then bring in more partners to build more trust. So it has a cumulative effect. And then if you do that well, by the time the opportunity and timing is right to approach a larger issue, you've got that in place. Because without that, I have found that collaborations of the magnitude that we're all speaking, just, in my opinion, just wouldn't be possible. So I like to think that all the work that we do every day is somehow setting the groundwork for these larger collaboratives to be possible.
I think this has been traditionally unnatural behavior for foundations. We like to be pretty autonomous. We like to have control over our grant making. We don't want others to tell us what to do. But in a speak even outside of Northeast Ohio, I think there is an appetite for this. I think there's been some real pushback on philanthropy to go beyond the 5% for grant making, both in terms of looking at alternative models for getting dollars into the community, but also using the other resources that we have, the human capital, organizational capital, reputational capital, network capital, and working together. And I think especially, and I know you had referenced in one of the questions collective impact, but I think there are conversations going on that are really pushing foundations around the country to take a look at how do we tackle bigger things, and the only way we can do that is together. So I'm seeing a lot of interest in the fund and what we're doing from other areas. And within within Northeast Ohio, we've joked about this. I don't think anybody who's been part of the fund can ever go back to business as it was before the fund. So we've got a connectivity that even if it's just calling up somebody to say, what do you think about this? That is breaking that old culture and adding kind of a new way of doing business. I find that terribly refreshing.
I think to add to that, though, too, the loss of resources, right? Federal government, local and state government has forced people to think differently. Just like in the community development field, we at one time had over 50 CDCs in Cleveland for years. Actually, I found the document when Neighborhood Progress was created, and the goal was to merge CDCs back in 1987. And look how long it's taken. And I think had it not been for the economic crisis, that forced people to have to get serious about that. So I think it's not only the loss of resources, but also the loss of Fortune 500 and 100 companies in Northeast Ohio has forced us to think differently about how resources get distributed. So that could be another piece of it. And I think from what we've seen over the last 10 years, we have cities all over the country now trying to, Cleveland doesn't get a lot of credit, but it's a model around whether it's the fund, whether it's the, anchor institutions. But right here in Cleveland, you got Campus District, which was, Tri-C, Cleveland State, and St. Vincent's. On the west side, you have the West 25th Street corridor with Lutheran and Metro, the nonprofits and businesses. So people are thinking differently about how to work together. And I think this just helps people learn.
Well, and I think we've seen some published articles recently on calling the Cleveland model from the university circle work. So it's the word is getting out. If we switch to thinking about our nonprofits, a message that they often get from their funder is, we want you to collaborate in part to reduce redundancy and achieve cost savings. So I wanted to give you all a chance to talk about, should we expect that from funders when they collaborate? Is it going to increase efficiency? I guess we don't want you to spend less, so I'm not sure we want the cost savings. But what are aside from the things you've already mentioned around achieving greater impact, has anybody ever said, well, we've just got too many foundations, we should merge them? Like the conversation in the nonprofit sector more generally, I guess.
Not around here. And when I mean, it's the golden rule. He or she who has the gold rules. And if you've got resources, it's a lot easier to justify self-existence and, self-perpetuation. You do in the community foundation world, and there's interesting stuff going on, but there is actually a lot of different models in community foundations, and there is a fair amount of merger in areas. nonprofits have to pass a public support test, and there's very few nonprofit boards that I know of that know what the heck a public support test is. But it is absolutely fundamental to a community foundation, and there are many community foundations that fail the public support test, Conneaut being one of them, that the IRS takes away their public charity status and they become a private foundation. And so it gets back to, I think, one of the motivators in almost every case I can think of as either an opportunity or a challenge. And I think in the community foundation world, we've got a lot of small community foundations that popped up with a few gifts, but can't sustain that level of revenue coming in. And so they're really they either don't have the resources to sustain themselves, or they're looking at failing the public support test. And so you're seeing some interesting models in community foundations around the country. And actually Aspen Institute and Center for Rural Entrepreneurship out of Nebraska have done a lot of work at looking at community foundation models in more rural areas and some of the different configurations. But overall, I think that's pretty unusual behavior on the part of foundations.
I guess, Rob, what I would say is that what I see happening, one, as foundations have to do, as we go through these collaborative efforts, it makes us appreciate even more how hard it is to do that. So when we're asking nonprofits to do it, if we don't walk the talk, Yeah. But I guess the other thing that I see happening that I think is just fabulous, and I think India referenced this in some of what she was talking about, is that I believe that in philanthropy we're becoming smarter about the fact that we really need to reframe our relationships with our grantees. Our grantees are not grantees. To me, they are partners, and they are people that we need to work with in many different ways because we both have the same goals. And I think that I see those types of relationships changing. I see the way in which we work with them changing. As India said, they convene every 3 years and sit and talk as a group. That's the way we need to work together to move things forward. So I know that's happening within Deaconess now in the workforce. We're 3 years into this. We have grantees that have been doing it forever, and we are the first to say, please teach us and help us learn. And so I think through reframing those relationships and changing them, there are going to be much better opportunities for collaborations to boil up as well. And I hope that it's not just collaborations among foundations, but foundations and grantees together, and then business and government partners, because many of our sectors have all of those partners at play.
And advice for nonprofits, if they have an opportunity to engage with a funder collaborative, I mean, it seems like there's a huge upside for nonprofits if there is a collaborative working in that space. But I guess what I've heard some say is now they're the only game in town. So you have to go through them if you want to get this type of money. And I guess I'm not sure I understand that complaint, because I guess they like the more diversified decision-making in the past. But is there any other kind of practical issue that you see for potential partners or grantees when they have an opportunity to work with funder collaboratives? I mean, some have challenges just working with one funder.
And I guess it's the not knowing kind of the culture of the collaborative that might be a bit of a challenge. I don't think any of us do a really great job of understanding the ecosystem that we're in. And certainly in Lorain County, we had a private foundation that totally shifted their funding to a very targeted focus. And we don't have a lot of foundations. And that was, that was 8 years ago, and we're still feeling repercussions from it. So I think anytime the music changes and the dance changes, it puts everything into flux. And so, one of the things with collaboratives is you've now got a whole lot of different foundations that are part of that. So kind of weaving through, it isn't as easy to figure out, well, Brian likes to hear this in a proposal and will probably support it, with his board if I put this kind of information in. All of a sudden, you've got a whole bunch of different perspectives that are coming into that decision making, and it might not be as easy to kind of figure out what the relationship is, if that makes sense.
India, I wanted to do one follow-up on that because in the University Circle example, one of the pitches that was made was, well, these folks are already getting ready to spend all this money, this investment in this area. All we're asking them to do is coordinate that a little bit. Now, that seems like it might be a lower bar, but was it?
Well, I mean, when we
Yeah.
were starting out, first, again, bringing big institutions
I know.
that typically hadn't worked together historically was huge. So we spent over the first year just building relationship, having dialogue. And really, after about the first year, people were like, this is kind of working, and that's when we bought in. So we brought in other people, like we brought in Lucy Kerman and John Cromer from the University of Pennsylvania. We went and looked at OSU partners. And if you think about at each one of those, this was an institution leading the collaboration, not a foundation. And they were in single neighborhoods. And here we thought, wow, we got 4 big anchors and 6 neighborhoods. This is an opportunity. And each of those, too, were born out of crisis, a rape, somebody getting stabbed that forced those institutions to have to do something. Whereas here we thought, how can we work together? And frankly, for over 20 plus years, the community development corporations and others in the community had tried to work with these institutions and there were small partnerships, but nothing significant. And so it's the first time really getting people to sit down and look at what is the opportunity to leverage that. And if, I could tell you one story after another, even, if you look at here with the master plan for cases, the first time the community was engaged from the very beginning with the CDCs, with the architects and the planners before it got started, not after, which created a different dialogue with the neighbors and with the community. And when, the unveiling came, people said they listened. That wouldn't have happened 10 or 15 years ago, probably 8 years ago. But I think realizing, again, for all of these institutions to get the best professors, the faculty, best residents, doctors, people want to feel safe about the neighborhoods around them. And that means engaging people in the community who also are consumers of these institutions. And I think that's something that we've learned around from other people around the country, but something that it was like the aha moment. On the other side, teaching the community how to interact with the institutions was equally important to create that win-win. So it wasn't an either or, but a both and,
All right, I feel like we've just begun to till the soil, but what I'd like to do is maybe open it up for some questions, and I know we have some online folks who might send us a question, but we've got a microphone too. Nora, would you mind? Sure. Thank you. If you have a question, yes, Gail? Oh, wait.
To this community.
Wait, if you could wait for the mic, thank you.
My voice is pretty strong. Thank you. Referring to the University Circle community and the issues of the economic development, where does East Cleveland fit into this?
Well, actually, East Cleveland is part of our Greater University Circle initiative. We had actually, before I actually got to the foundation, Buckeye Shaker in East Cleveland was not part of it, so I was at Neighborhood Progress, and we created our own map called Areas of Mutual Impact, and I added East Cleveland and Buckeye Shaker, so I wouldn't make the foundation and my other friends upset with me, but that's why having worked in the neighborhood, when UCI was talking about doing housing, you're landlocked. You can only go east or go south. And when I got to the foundation, we just opened up the map and created it. And we mapped out all the housing development at the time that was being done. We looked at all the public schools, parochial schools, and charter schools. And we mapped out where, at that time, there was probably 1,500 units of development that was planned between the neighborhoods and University Circle. And when we mapped it out, and people were like, you're right. And so that again, giving people that, because typically that's not the work of a foundation, but hiring people that have been on the ground doing this work really brought a different light to that. And we actually did the building condition land use. We did use Neo Can Do and used the university again to really map out what was going on so people could visually see that.
I wonder if you could talk to new leadership. I think, India, you had mentioned there was some new leadership at the anchors. It strikes me that leaving egos at the door allows opportunity for collaboration. I wonder if you all could speak to that new leadership and the significance it played in your collaboration projects.
Well, I think, again, you had people who weren't from Cleveland that didn't come with the attitudes. You had people that came from other places that, one, understood the need for partnership, that understood the need for diversity, that were willing to have the hard conversations to say we got to do something different. And just getting people in the room to have that dialogue. Had Ron listened to the people from here, and I know people don't want to hear it, the old paradigm, and not pull people in a room together just to have the conversation, we wouldn't be here. But he didn't listen to that, and he built his own relationships individually and then together, and then interjected that after we got that, I want your senior staff to work with my senior staff, and then Lillian and I and others begin building those relationships within the institutions. And again, I think it was learning from each other how to have the dialogue. And I remember Lucy Kerman, and this was well before this started in another avenue, talked about how communities and institutions don't get along because community activists go to the institutions banging on the door. You're going to do this in the neighborhood. They're there to do health care or education and don't do housing development. And that if you want to learn to talk to institutions, you got to understand what you bring to the table to help them understand their business, and then figure out how the two can come together. And that always stuck in the back of my mind. And having spent over 20 years before that trying to work with these institutions, really taking that attitude and actually training neighborhood connections when we came in, they're organizers and things, teaching them the same thing, that you have institutions that are big bureaucracies, whether it's the foundation, the city, or whatever. But within those institutions, you have people that care. People that are as passionate as us, and we have to find the people that care. And one great example from this, we just lost our best person, Danielle Price, in a good way, to university hospitals from the work she's been doing the last 4.5 years here, and university hospitals just hired her as Director of Community Health Engagement. Someone that was an organizer now working in the institution, so that's a win-win for us.
I'll respond from the fund a little bit differently. We had the benefit of having some long-standing leadership that got the fund started and got it anchored, and then we started getting pretty significant turnover in CEOs. So we've had the challenge of how do you sustain a collaborative when you have organizations that are key that might not, you've got somebody new coming in. So how do you orient them? How do you engage them? How much depth and stickiness do you have within the organization? And that's, if you're going to have a collaborative that's going to stay over time, you got to figure out how to do it. We kind of call it the special sauce. And we've tried on several occasions to describe it, and the best effort I think we had was when we actually used pictures and models and stuff and put it together. But there is something that has to be very intentional about that in terms of communication, in terms of clarity of what you're focusing on, in terms of passion and fun and all that keeps everybody at the table. Otherwise, I think it begins to wither and fade away.
And I'm going to add one thing, transparency.
Yep.
And being honest. Might not always agree, but if you communicate and you're transparent, that is that's the special sauce.
And I would just add with the restructuring pilot project, what was different about that is that we all came together, and Denise and I convened, but really the way things had worked in the past with philanthropy in town is that, really everyone deferred to Cleveland and Gunn to be the conveners, to say this is an important topic. Cleveland and Gunn were at the table, but somehow Denise and I decided to convene everyone, and the group was very willing to allow us to move forward, and we just became the de facto chairs. So, that I didn't really think about it much at the time, but in reflection past, it was really important to say to the community and amongst each other, we all have a responsibility to do this work. We can't expect the two largest foundations in town to always take leadership. So when I think about new leadership, I think it's about challenging ourselves, the other foundations in town, to say, if we care passionately about an issue, we have to be willing to step up. And yeah, we definitely want to partner with people, but that is something we need to be doing.
Other questions or comments? John Yankee's got something.
I don't want to throw you a truly, truly difficult question right at the end of this, but I have to get ready for class next weekend, so your answers will help me very much. Each of you has referenced trust as being at the core of success of these. I would love to have any additional comments or just reinforcements of what you've already said about this notion of trust, because all the research does show that it is at the core of success for collaboration. So anything that you want to either reinforce or reflect on differently would be most welcome.
John, one of the things that the fund did early on, and it was out of efficiency, is that Cleveland Foundation shared Brad Whitehead, who they had hired as a fellow. And we decided, we didn't know whether this thing was going to last a year, okay? And so we didn't want to hire staff and incorporate and go through all of that. And so there was, in addition to having this kind of parallel funds at the different community foundations, we created a loan staff model. And many foundations, large and small, loaned a staff that would meet every week and get together and hammer through, what's this agenda? What do we need to be focusing on? What's the appropriate role for philanthropy? What can we put into the pot? What resources do we have? I honestly believe that was a huge precursor that built the trust, and it went beyond the folks in that room. So I chaired the evaluation committee initially. I didn't go to every loan staff meeting, but I knew what was going on, and the process that I knew these foundations were all meeting and hammering through that, and I saw the outcome of that, gave me more trust in the process. So I think India and Deb have both said it, I can't express enough that it takes time. And unfortunately, that's something that we've got a lot of challenges for right now. But I think there's no shortcuts to trust building. You've got to work together, you've got to succeed together, you've got to fail together, and you've got to be authentic with one another. So.
And I think being flexible and nimble, right? When you do this, you don't know what the unintended consequences are. We don't know everything. And being upfront and saying, I don't know everything. Sometimes we have people, I tell people, some people got to know A, B, C, all the way to Z. And some people just build it as they go. So understanding how each person works, but also being honest and being willing to take some risk and say, this isn't working. And if it's not, pivot and move on. I think that's really important.
Yeah, my experience has been that trust is really what makes things happen. And, you talked about process, Brian. I mean, trust to me is the glue that holds that process together. If you don't have it, the process is going to fall apart. And so I think we have to take opportunities to seek and create trust all along the way, because without it, nothing will happen.
Yeah, and trust, it's the glue, it's also the stretchiness, because I think it's the trust that allows the folks that are metric-oriented and action-oriented and want to get something, if they have enough trust that the folks that have a tolerance for patience can go through the conversation, that helps.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anybody want to offer a more challenging question than Professor Yankee, the 11th hour? All right, well, this is not the final bite at the apple. We're going to convene and adjourn and go to a reception, but if you would please join me in thanking our panelists for their wonderful comments tonight.